I can still hear the clink of wine glasses and the soft hum of conversation as golden light spilled across the long table at my parents' beach house in Galveston, Texas. Thanksgiving was always a spectacle in our family linen napkins catered sides and just enough forced cheer to cover up the judgment beneath. I sat quietly near the end of the table, sipping my cinnamon chai, while my cousin Ashley, draped in her designer suit and smug confidence, raised her glass. "Big news," she said, beaming. "I just passed the bar. I start at Franklin and Howell in Dallas next month." Applause erupted. My Uncle Scott lifted his glass, toasting the pride of the Mitchells. I smiled faintly, my fingers wrapped around the warm mug. No one had asked about my news. No one knew I'd just closed a 3-year supply deal with a major hotel chain, more than Ashley's starting salary. But to them, I was still just the girl with a bakery. "And what about you?" Grace Aunt Carol chimed in, sweet as syrup. "Still making cupcakes, I didn't flinch." "Still running Grace's Hearth Bakery, yes." Laughter bubbled around the table, but none of them knew what I was about to reveal, not yet. Ashley let out a soft laugh as she sipped her wine, her perfectly manicured hand resting on her fiancé's shoulder like a claim. "Well, if you ever get tired of frosting cupcakes, Grace," she said, voice smooth and condescending, "Franklin and Howell is always hiring legal assistants. Great benefits, cushy hours. Might be a good step up." I met her gaze steady and calm, even as 100 emotions swirled beneath the surface. I wanted to say so much, but instead I smiled. "Appreciate the offer, Ash, but I'm doing just fine." The clink of silverware filled the silence that followed, awkward for everyone but her. I knew how they saw me, the black sheep who walked away from a stable path, the one who traded spreadsheets for cinnamon rolls. What they didn't see was the spreadsheet I'd reviewed just that morning, projected returns from 6 rental properties, 2 startup investments, and an equity stake in a regional grocery chain. They didn't know I owned the building where Grace's Hearth stood, or that I'd just signed a silent partnership agreement that would double my quarterly revenue. But I didn't share any of that. Not yet. That night wasn't for bragging. It was for watching, remembering, and letting them speak freely in the comfort of their assumptions. I looked around the table, Uncle Scott, with his forced chuckle, Aunt Carol, refilling her glass while giving me the side eye, and Ashley, in full performance mode, rattling off the name of her new corporate client like a trophy. "We just closed a big merger," she said, smirking. "Their general counsel said I flagged something their whole team missed. It was kind of a big deal." I stirred the last bit of chai in my mug, thinking about the same company, Grayson Tech, and how they'd unknowingly sold a string of underused buildings to one of my holding groups. I now owned the land beneath 3 of their regional offices. Her firm had likely written those contracts. I didn't need to say a word to feel the power of that knowledge, but it was Grandma's voice that pulled me back. "I just don't get it, honey," she said gently, as we stood in the kitchen, later drying dishes together, like we always had since I was a kid. "You're so smart. You could have been like Ashley. Big firm, big salary, real success." I paused, holding a dish towel in my hands, wondering how to explain that success looked different for me. "Not everyone wants boardrooms and business cards," I said softly. "Some of us like building things you can touch." Grandma sighed, worry creasing her brow. "But what about your future? Your family restaurants are risky, Grace." I nodded, understanding her heart, even as I thought of the penthouse I'd bought last month, ocean view mortgage-free. I had plans, I always had, but they weren't loud. They weren't framed in degrees or titles. They were real quiet and mine. As we loaded the last dish, I heard laughter from the living room and a fresh burst of applause for Ashley. I walked back in invisible again. But tomorrow that invisibility would end, and it wouldn't be me knocking on their doors. it would be them walking into mine. The night air was cool and salty. As I stepped outside, the distant sound of waves crashing against the Galveston shore, reminding me how far I'd come since I first stood in front of that crumbling pub, the one I turned into Grace's hearth. I slid behind the wheel of my car and drove slowly through the dim streets, past familiar landmarks, Mom and Dad's old accounting firm, the faded corner bookstore we used to visit after Sunday church, and finally my bakery. Its windows glowed like lanterns in the dark, the late-night prep team still inside kneading dough and setting up for the morning rush. But I didn't stop there. I parked around back, unlocked the alley door, and climbed the narrow staircase to the real reason I never needed anyone's approval. My office was quiet, minimalist, bathed in soft white light and the faint smell of cinnamon drifting through the vents. This was where I made the moves no one ever saw coming. 7 LLCs, 2 property holding groups, and a growing investment portfolio sat neatly categorized in labeled binders and encrypted spreadsheets. I sat at my desk, rolled up the sleeve of my cardigan, and opened the Carter development file, the last puzzle piece in a plan 4 years in the making. Tomorrow, the company Ashley bragged about closing deals with would sit across from me at this very table, not in a glass tower, not at her firm, here, over coffee and warm croissants. They didn't even know yet that I was the majority stakeholder in the very redevelopment project they were planning. All signed, all legal, all under names that wouldn't connect back to Grace the baker, not until I wanted them to. I leaned back in my leather chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment, letting the weight of it all settle. Every joke they made at dinner, every patronizing smile, every backhanded comment, it didn't sting like it used to. It just reminded me that staying quiet was the best strategy I ever chose. I never needed to explain. I just needed to build, and tomorrow they would see. I glanced at the framed photo on my desk, me and Grandma from years ago, her arms wrapped around me after my bakery's opening day. She meant well, even if she still saw my apron as a symbol of settling. But I hadn't settled. I'd laid a foundation. I checked my calendar, confirming the 9 a.m. meeting, then sent a brief email to Charles Whitaker, my most trusted partner in all this. Room ready. Coffee will be hot. I smiled to myself, imagining Ashley's reaction when she walked into the bakery and realized the meeting wasn't for pastries, it was for power. As I powered down the computer and turned off the lights, I paused at the top of the stairs, looking down at the warm kitchen below. Tomorrow wouldn't just be another work day. It would be the day the story changed for good. I arrived at the bakery just before sunrise. The streets were still quiet, washed in that soft silver light that only shows up for early risers and insomniacs. Laia, my manager, was already inside, unlocking the front door and humming some old country tune as she flipped on the lights. "Morning, boss," she said with a smile, handing me a fresh brew just the way I like it, light cinnamon splash of oat milk, no sugar. Back room's all prepped, but I still don't get why this big shot wants to meet here instead of some fancy office. I smiled and took a slow sip, because sometimes the biggest decisions happen where people least expect them to. She gave me a half-curious look, but knew better than to ask more. It was just one of those mornings where the air felt thick with something coming. At 9 a.m., sharp the front bell jingled, and Charles Whitaker walked in like he always did. Casual jeans, navy quarter zip, not a single thing about him screaming power broker, but that's exactly what he was. He gave me a subtle nod. "Warning, Miss Mitchell," he grinned. Then louder for the sake of the staff. "For show, could I get a cappuccino?" I chuckled and slipped behind the counter, pulling the shot and steaming the milk with muscle memory, our little game, playing out like always. No one around us had any idea This man had helped me quietly secure over a dozen properties across Galveston strip malls, office buildings, even a few neglected parking lots that were about to become prime real estate. But before I could hand him the cup, the bell rang again. And there she was, Ashley, punctual as ever, blazer crisp heels, sharp briefcase in hand. Her eyes locked on Charles, clearly surprised. "Mr. Whitaker, I wasn't expecting you here so early," she said, voice polished and professional. Charles took the cup from me, then glanced at her with his usual calm. "I prefer to meet where the real decisions are made," he said smoothly, then shot me a knowing look. Ashley blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Wait. Grace, what are you doing here?" she asked. Like I was just some barista who'd wandered into a boardroom, Charles turned back to her. "Miss Mitchell makes the best cappuccino in Galveston," he said with a quiet grin. "Care to join our meeting?" She hesitated. Meeting. He motioned toward the back glass-paneled room regarding the East Bay redevelopment project. "Shall we?" I didn't say a word. I just grabbed the binder from beneath the counter, its cover gold embossed with the name no one in my family had heard yet, Mitchell Bay Capital. Ashley followed us, still trying to piece it all together. Her steps were slower now, her voice quieter. Something told me she knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary morning. And she was absolutely right. The meeting room in the back of the bakery didn't look like much from the outside, just a frosted glass door and a quiet sign that read, "Private." Most customers assumed it was for special brunches or office parties. But inside, it was a different world. Wide walnut table, high-backed chairs, discreet security camera tucked into the corner, pendant lighting casting a warm, professional glow. The kind of room that didn't need to prove anything. It simply spoke for itself. Charles took a seat at the head, casually placing a thick binder on the table while I set the cappuccino down beside him. I could feel Ashley's eyes darting around, trying to make sense of the space trying to place me in it. She still hadn't sat down. "I'll need a second witness for the final signatures," Charles said, opening the binder. "Perhaps your cousin could assist." Ashley let out a short, awkward laugh. "Grace, oh, no, she's just the owner here. She doesn't need to be involved in legal documentation." She looked at me, smiling like someone trying to be polite at a kid's lemonade stand. Charles didn't smile back. "On the contrary," he said, matter of fact, "she's the key party in this transaction." I pulled out my chair, calm and composed, and sat down without looking away. "Actually, Ashley," I said, voice steady, "you're the one who doesn't need to be here. But since you are, you might as well witness something memorable." Before she could answer, the bell up front chimed again. Footsteps, familiar voices. My grandfather and Uncle Scott appeared just outside the glass, peering into the room with confused expressions. "What's going on?" Grandpa asked, stepping inside. "Why is Mr. Whitaker here? What's this about?" Ashley opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Charles stood and greeted them with his signature warmth. "I invited them," he said. It felt fitting to finalize this deal in the place where it all began. "What deal?" Uncle Scott asked. Ashley's eyes flicked to mine, and for the first time in years, she looked unsettled. I slowly turned the binder so the gold lettering faced them all. Mitchell Bay Capital. I reached for the remote and mirrored my laptop to the wall-mounted screen. The title slide appeared in clean, bold font, Mitchell Bay Capital Consolidation and Strategic Expansion. Then came the map, a satellite view of downtown Galveston with dozens of properties outlined in glowing gold. I watched their faces shift from confusion to disbelief, from disbelief to something closer to awe. No one said a word. Then I spoke. These parcels, the redevelopment project, the holding groups, they've all been managed under various firms, quietly, strategically, and as of this morning, they're all being consolidated under one name. I looked at Ashley, her hands gripping the chair now. Mine. And just as the room began to absorb that, the front door opened once more. This time it was Grandma. Grandma stepped inside, moving slower than usual, her purse clutched close, and her eyes scanning the room with hesitation. She hadn't been part of the initial plan, but part of me knew she'd show up. Curiosity always got the best of her, especially when it came to family. She glanced from Ashley to Charles, then to the gold-lettered binder at the center of the table. Her gaze finally landed on me, and her expression shifted first to confusion, then to concern. "What is all this, Grace?" she asked, voice soft, like she didn't want to interrupt something sacred. I stood slowly, walked around the table, and handed her a printout of the map, our city lit up in gold, each property marked with initials, trust names, and company codes that all led back to me. "It's everything," I said gently, "everything I've built." She looked down, eyes scanning the paper, lips parting slightly in disbelief. "I thought you just ran the bakery," she whispered. "I do," I said, placing a hand lightly on her shoulder. "And I also run this." I gestured toward the binder, the screen, the stunned room. For a long moment she said nothing. Ashley remained frozen, her eyes flicking between the documents and the display still trying to undo years of assumptions. Grandpa sat down hard, like the weight of it all had knocked the wind out of him. This is worth a fortune," he murmured, squinting at the asset list. "You own half the town," I exhaled slowly. "More than half." Charles nodded, his tone now one of open pride. "Your granddaughter saw what others didn't. She recognized opportunity where the rest of the world saw rundown blocks and forgotten storefronts, and she moved quietly with patience, strategy, and clarity." Ashley finally spoke, her voice brittle. "But we are firm, those were our clients. We drafted contracts for these parcels." "Yes," Charles said, without flinching. "And your cousin was the beneficiary." Ashley's mouth opened, then closed. Her face, so often poised and polished now, betrayed a deep unraveling. I turned back to Grandma, who hadn't moved. She looked at me, eyes glassy, with something I couldn't quite read. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked, almost like she was talking to the little girl I used to be. I took a breath, feeling everything I'd carried for years swell in my chest. "Because no one ever really asked," I said. "You all thought you knew what I was worth based on the apron I wore. I let you believe that while I built something that didn't need your permission." Silence fell again, thick and heavy. I looked at each of them one by one. No arrogance, just truth. And then the final envelope slid across the table, the one with the closing documents that would officially merge all entities under Mitchell Bay Capital. Charles handed me the pen. "All that's left," he said, "is your signature." I looked at the pen, resting on the table, sleek silver, heavier than it needed to be. Funny how something so small could carry so much weight. I reached out slowly, fingers steady, and picked it up. Charles sat back, giving me space, and no one in the room made a sound. I could feel their eyes on me. Ashley's tight with disbelief, Grandpa's still searching for the version of me he thought he knew, and Grandma's filled with something more complicated. Not judgment, not pride exactly. Something deeper, maybe realization. I flipped open the final document, scanning it one last time, even though I'd read every line a dozen times over the last month. Everything was in place. The years of quiet moves, the shell companies, the property trusts, the silent partnerships, they all came to this moment. I signed, once, then again, then once more. With each stroke, it felt like something old was peeling away. The girl they remembered, the one who left college to bake bread, she was still here, but she'd become something more. I set the pen down and exhaled. Charles smiled. "Congratulations, Grace," he said warmly. Mitchell Bay Capital is now officially yours, every square foot of it. Ashley leaned forward, her voice low, almost trembling. This portfolio, it's worth hundreds of millions. I nodded. It wasn't about the money, I said quietly. It was about building something that couldn't be taken away, something that didn't need applause to matter. Grandpa shook his head slowly, still not fully processing it. All this time, we thought you were just baking. I finished for him not with bitterness, but with clarity. And I still am. But while you were watching Ashley climb her ladder, I was building my own. Ashley's voice cracked. But you wore an apron, Grace. You showed up to family dinners with flour on your cheek. I smiled gently. I wear a lot of things, Ashley. Sometimes an apron, sometimes a tailored coat. The difference is I never needed anyone else's title to define what I was capable of. Grandma reached for my hand, squeezing it tightly. Her eyes were wet. I didn't know, she whispered. I wanted so much for you, but I didn't see what you already had. I nodded, my throat tightening. You didn't have to. I did. Charles rose to his feet, sliding the signed binder into his briefcase. I'll have the team finalize everything by end of day, he said. Press will get word tomorrow, but for now, let's keep it quiet. I looked out the glass, where customers were beginning to trickle into the bakery, unaware that just a few feet away, a real estate empire had changed hands. The bell rang again. I glanced up. This time it was the city planning director, and he wasn't here for croissants. The city planning director, Mr. Ellis, stood in the doorway in a charcoal suit that didn't quite match the smell of cinnamon and espresso drifting through the bakery. He looked slightly uncomfortable, scanning the space, like he'd wandered into the wrong room, but when his eyes met mine, he nodded with purpose. Miss Mitchell, he said, stepping in. We're ready for the next phase when you are. I motioned him inside. He took a seat across from Charles, who offered a quiet greeting, already sliding the supplemental documents across the table. Ashley remained seated, silent now, her confidence visibly unraveling, as she realized this meeting was bigger than any courtroom she'd walked into. Grandpa sat beside her arms, crossed his mind clearly, still back at the moment he'd seen my name printed above blocks of downtown Galveston. Grandma hadn't let go of my hand. I could feel her thumb gently moving across my knuckles, like she was trying to reassure herself this was still her granddaughter sitting here, not some stranger in a power seat. As Mr. Ellis began to review the project blueprints, I watched the lines of city blocks expand on the screen. Retail corridors, public green space, low-income housing, all of it carefully folded into a vision I had shaped quietly over the last 4 years. This wasn't just acquisition, it was transformation, thoughtful, sustainable, long-term, the kind of development I'd always wanted to see in my hometown, but never trusted anyone else to do right. And now somehow it was mine to guide. My voice was calm, professional, as I walked Mr. Ellis through the adjusted timelines and budget projections, but inside I felt the echo of every time someone had called my work cute or small. Every moment I'd been dismissed with a smile. All those memories lived here under the polished surface of this moment. When the meeting wrapped, Mr. Ellis stood and extended a hand. You've built something rare, Miss Mitchell. Thoughtful, grounded. This city's lucky to have you steering it. I shook his hand with a small nod, gratitude swelling inside me, but also a weight I hadn't expected. Because now, it wasn't just about proving myself. It was about legacy. As he left, the door swung shut behind him with a soft click. The room emptied slowly. Ashley didn't say another word. Grandpa didn't offer another joke, and Grandma gave me a long, lingering hug before whispering, I see you now, Grace. I really see you. I stood alone at the window once the room cleared, watching people move through the bakery, Parents with toddlers, retirees, reading the paper college kids grabbing breakfast before class. None of them knew what had just happened upstairs, and I liked it that way, because success like this didn't need a spotlight. It just needed roots. As the sun rose higher over the coast, I thought of everything ahead, press expansion scrutiny, and for the first time in years, I felt something more than pride. I felt ready. That evening, I sat alone in my upstairs office, the city spread out before me in soft twilight. The rooftops I now owned shimmered under the last gold light of day, quiet and still like they were waiting for me to take my next breath. Downstairs, the scent of fresh bread floated up through the vents, grounding me in the place where it all began. I thought about my family, their silence, their stares, the slow crumbling of assumptions. I didn't need apologies. I didn't need recognition. What I needed, I'd already built with my own hands, one brick, one deal, one sleepless night at a time. I wasn't the girl who needed their permission anymore. I was the woman who chose her own name and then quietly turned it into something no one could take away. Betrayal taught me how to listen only to my own voice. Loyalty, true loyalty, came from the people who believed when there was nothing to see. And rebirth. It happened when I stopped waiting to be invited and decided to lead. Life lesson. Never underestimate the quiet ones. We are often the ones planting seeds while everyone else is looking at the sky. If this story moved, you share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more stories that remind you just how powerful you already are.